Chapter 1 Lower 6th. My first term I was 16 and had just finished my GCSEs when my parents announced that my father had been posted to Thailand and that, for my A-levels, I would be going to boarding school. Maybe I should back up a little and explain my circumstances. My name is Patrick Gore Handley, yes, double-barreled. And my father is a career diplomat in the United Kingdom Foreign Office. When I was young we had lived in a number of different capital cities, mostly in Europe. Then, when I was 12, my father had started a long spell driving a desk in Whitehall. Our family home is in Sussex and he commuted daily into London. This meant that I was able to attend a co-educational, independent school near our home on a day-pupil basis. I loved Loughborough School and had settled in immediately. I can honestly say the 4 years I spent there were the most enjoyable period of schooling I had had so far. Naturally, I didn't want to leave Loughborough and kicked up merry hell when told I would have to move to another school. But my protests were in vain. Loughborough didn't take boarders and I was deemed too young to lodge with friends in Sussex. My mood was not improved when my parents told me that the school they had selected for me was in Derbyshire and deep in the Dales at that, and that it was an all-boys school. At the age of 16, I had recently discovered that female schoolfellows are a decided asset in any young man's life. Now I faced the prospect only having boys as companions. However, grumble as I might, I knew I had no choice in the matter and that in September I was going to join the 6th form at St. Hilda's. I expressed surprise that an all-boys school had such an oddly feminine name. My mother patiently explained to me that before Henry VIL dissolved the monasteries in the 16th century, an abbey dedicated to St. Hilda had stood on the site now occupied by the school. One of Henry's favored courtiers had purchased the abbey estates for a song and that his descendants had lived there for many years. Somewhere along the way one member of the family had built himself a new fancy home and that this, in turn, had been Gothicized in the 19th century. After the First World War, successive death duties had crippled the family fortunes and forced them to sell their ancestral home. This was when St. Hilda's became a school. Whilst not among the top flight of independent schools, it nevertheless had a very sound reputation and, although not large, was much favored by parents in the diplomatic service who had troublesome sons to place. Such was to be my future. My parents drove me up to Derbyshire at the start of term and, on the way north, announced they would themselves be leaving for Thailand the following day. "Now, darling," my mother cooed, "I'm sure you are going to really enjoy it at St. Hilda's. Promise me you will not sulk but enter fully into the life of the school. That way you will settle in more quickly and get the most out of your time there." Reluctantly I gave her my promise. Things started to look up as we drove through the gates of St. Hilda's and up to the main school building. Out of the car window I noticed a small group of girls playing hockey. I had thought St. Hilda's only took boys. Maybe I was wrong and they admitted girls in the 6th form. I knew some otherwise single-sex independent schools did this. My spirits lifted. Father drew up outside the main school building. It was a typical grandiose Victorian pile, replete with multiple wings and turrets, mullioned windows, heavy oak doors, and other Gothic details. A porter arrived with a trolley to take my luggage. As it came out of the boot, I was somewhat surprised at the amount of luggage I seemed to need. The things I had laid out on the bed at home would easily have fitted into one suitcase and a small trunk. However, I now seemed to be the possessor of 3 suitcases, a trunk, and a number of other, smaller boxes. Mother saw my puzzled look. "I know it seems a lot, Patrick," she said, but the school's list of essential items was extensive. I had to take her word for it and watched silently as the porter wheeled my things out of sight and, presumably, up to my dormitory. The 3 of us entered the building and walked into a bright sunny office with headmaster's secretary painted on the door. A middle-aged woman offered us coffee and asked if we would mind waiting a few moments until the headmaster was free to see us. Some 10 minutes later, we were ushered into Dr. McPherson's office. Somewhat to my surprise, the head was a comparatively young man. I took him to be in his early 40s. All my previous head teachers had seemed ancient. "Welcome to St. Hilda's," the head said with a smile, gesturing that we should sit. "So this is Patrick," he continued. "I am sure you will be very happy here." At this point my father interjected, "Excuse me, I don't wish to appear rude, but my wife and I are leaving for Thailand tomorrow, so we really need to get back to London. May we say goodbye to Patrick and leave him in your tender care?" "Of course," Dr. McPherson replied in a hurried and embarrassed farewell ensured. "Be sure to write. My mother exhorted me for the umpteenth time. You, father, and I will be extremely occupied in Bangkok, but we look forward to hearing how you are getting on." And with that they left. "Well, Patrick, just you and me, eh?" my new head teacher said with a grin. "St. Hilda's is only a small school, but we have traditions of which we are extremely proud, and it will probably be helpful if I explained how some of these will affect you personally." I nodded politely and tried to look interested and eager. Dr. McPherson continued, "The first headmaster of St. Hilda's back in the 1920s was a man very much ahead of his time. The constitution of the school specified that it had to be for boys only, but this head deemed it important for young men to understand what it was like to be a woman in what was, at that time, still a male-orientated society. He therefore established a program of compulsory gender studies to be taken in the sixth form. That tradition continues to this day, although, of course, society has changed greatly over the intervening years." After this preamble, Dr. McPherson paused briefly and took a deep breath. "Now you are going to find the next bit of what I have to tell you a bit bizarre, but I can assure you that our program has served the school well for nearly 100 years. This remark was more than a bit peculiar, and I sat forward in my seat, anxious now to learn what lay in store for me. "On entering the lower sixth, as you are," Dr. McPherson explained, "all boys are required to dress and live the first half of the autumn term as girls." Well, you could have knocked me down with a feather. I couldn't believe I had heard him correctly and said so. "Yes, you did hear correctly," Dr. McPherson assured me. "But rather than my trying to explain the principles behind this program, it might be better if one of your fellow pupils tells you how it works. I am sure that you will have many questions, and it will be easier and less embarrassing for you to put these to someone who is already on the program than to your headmaster." He smiled kindly at my puzzled expression. "I promise you it will be all right," he said. "All-out pupils go through the same experience and come out the other side the better for it." With that he pressed his intercom. "Miss Hayward, can you please ask Fiona to step in now?" The door opened and a tall blonde girl entered. She was wearing a light gray two-piece skirt suit, a pale green blouse, nylons, and shoes with a medium-height heel. Her ash blonde hair hung straight and long over her shoulders. I had to assume this vision of loveliness, which in other circumstances I could have really fancied was in fact another boy pupil, but it was hard to believe. "Ah, Fiona," said the headmaster, "let me introduce you to our new pupil. This is Patrick Gore-Handley." Fiona Patrick, Fiona Symington, we politely shook hands. "But we need a girl's name for Patrick," Dr. McPherson exclaimed. "Now let me see, Patrick, Patricia, Tricia. We don't have a Tricia at St. Hilda's at present, I believe. How do you feel about Tricia, my boy?" My mind was in a whirl. I seemed to have been dumped by my parents in a madhouse. What could I say? I had never thought what it would be like had I been born a girl, but here I was being told I would be living the next few weeks as one and, now, being asked to approve of the girl's name they have chosen for me. I could only nod my head dumbly. I was too shocked to speak. Good, that's settled then, said Dr. McPherson. Fiona, take Tricia up to her dormitory and explain how our program works. Yes, sir, replied Fiona as she turned to leave. I'll see you later, Tricia, said Dr. McPherson when you have had time to settle in. Dumbly, I followed Fiona out of the headmaster's office and up the main flight of stairs that rose majestically from the entrance hall. Fiona led me up the stairs, down a long corridor, and into a large room. As we walked, Fiona told me, my real name is Paul, but when I had to select a feminine name, I sort of liked Fiona. As we arrive at our destination, I worked out it must be on the first floor of one of the side wings. My parents have dragged me around stately homes all the time we have been living in England, so perforce I have, by a process of osmosis, come to understand a bit about how they worked. I surmised that this room had originally been one of the principal bedrooms of the house. Now, however, it was clearly a dormitory. 8 beds occupied the space previously devoted to a single person. 3 beds were set against each of the side walls, with a further 2 facing the windows. Beside each bed was a small wardrobe with hanging space above and drawers below. On the other side of the bed was a small bedside cupboard, and a rack of shelves had been fixed to the wall above each bedhead. Although the room must have originally been sumptuously decorated and furnished, the walls were now painted a neutral cream. 4 armchairs were arranged in front of the windows, which had simple blinds instead of the elaborate hangings that would have been there previously. Fiona flung herself into one of the chairs and indicated I should take another. As I sat down, I noticed my various suitcases and parcels were on and against one bed. There was no trace of my trunk. Fiona noticed my glance. That will be your bed, she said. Tom will have taken your trunk to the house common room for you to unpack there. There isn't much space in the dormitories for things other than clothes. I know this all seems like some bizarre nightmare at the moment, she continued, kindly, but I'll try and make sense of it for you. As I know the headmaster will have told you, the original head had some pretty eccentric ideas about boys learning to experience what life was like for girls back in the 1920s. The odd thing is, his ideas seem to have worked, and St. Hilda's has a reputation for turning out well-rounded graduates who goes on to do well at university. The way it works like this, the school is divided into 4 houses: lavender, honeysuckle, clover, and heather. They are named after plants that attract bees. You are in lavender and I am your head of house. I don't know how well you know your gardening lore, but, as I said, the houses are all named after plants particularly liked by bees, and the 6th form is structured in a way similar to a beehive. All lower 6th boys have to spend half a term dressed as girls. During that time you are known as grubs. At half term you then have the choice of continuing to dress as a girl, or reverting back to male garb. However, if you choose the latter, you are automatically debarred from holding any position of responsibility in the school. You can't become a prefect or captain of games. We know this group as drones. If, on the other hand, you elect to stay in girl mode, you start to get involved with helping run the school. Lower 6th pupils typically help with sports coaching to the younger boys, or assisting in the library, or helping out the head of house. These boy girls are called workers. Now, if we move on to the upper 6th, at the beginning of your upper 6th year, the headmaster announces which boys will be prefects or team captains. If you are lucky enough to be chosen as one of these, you enter the upper 6th as a honeybee. And one of the honeybees is selected to be head of school and is known as the queen bee. There, I'm sure everything is as clear as mud now. Any questions? Well, of course I had hundreds but didn't know where to start. Fiona took pity on me. It is quite rare for a new boy to join the school in the 6th form, she said. Most of us have been here since we were 7 or 8, so playing a female role in the 6th form seems perfectly natural. In fact, many boys plead to be allowed to start cross-dressing earlier in the school so that they get practiced before it becomes important. I tried to put my racing brain into some sort of order. If I have got it right, I began tentatively, I have no choice but to dress as a girl for the next 5 or 6 weeks. But, after that initiation, I can go back to being a proper boy for the rest of my time here? Fiona nodded. I continued, well, that's what I'll do. I can just about stomach being seen as an idiot for a few weeks, and then I can settle down to a normal existence for the rest of my time here. Well, it is your choice, Fiona cautioned, but remember, if you do take that path, you will be classified as a drone and sidelined from all the interesting things you can take part in as a 6th former. This brought me up a bit short. At my previous school I had aspired and looked forward to becoming a prefect. It now looked as though that would never happen for me. Fiona spotted my uncertainty. You don't have to take a decision now, she said. Femininity is compulsory for the next few weeks anyway. See how you get on and make your mind up about the future at half-term. This was decent advice, so I slowly nodded my head in acceptance of the inevitable. Fiona immediately perked up. Let's take a look at what clothes your mum has packed for you, she said. Of course, Mum and Dad would have to have known about this ridiculous tradition of cross-dressing, and no doubt Mum would have been sent a list of required clothing. But they had never indicated what lay in store for me. I really felt betrayed. It was bad enough my parents taking me out of the school I loved and sending me off to board, and I could just about cope with their evident haste to get away to Thailand, but this final betrayal of trust was the final straw, and I had to fight back tears. I wasn't going to let Fiona know how upset I was. Boys keep a stiff upper lip, crying is for girls, but I'm going to be a girl for the next few weeks, so does that make it okay for me to cry? Whilst I was regaining my composure, Fiona had thrown one of my cases onto the bed and had opened it. Well, you won't need this one for a while, she said as the contents of the case were revealed. Inside, neatly folded, was my boy's school uniform, long gray trousers, white shirts, tie, blazer, etc. Fiona snapped the case shut. Tom can put this down in the storeroom until half-term. You won't be needing these before then. On second thoughts, has your mum packed a shaving kit for you? You will need that. She rummaged through the case again and produced a wash bag. Success, she cried. The first case was unceremoniously dumped on the floor and the next one heaved up onto the bed. I now realized why I had so much more luggage than I had thought I needed. The second case contained items much more to Fiona's liking. This is more like it, she announced as she pulled forth a pleated blue-green-white tartan skirt. This was followed by a second skirt, 4 cream blouses with Peter Pan collars, a navy blue sweater, a blazer, with the buttons on the wrong side, and a pair of black patent leather girls' shoes. Then things became very embarrassing. Under the outerwear was a pile of cotton knickers, some blue and some green, navy tights, and, worst of all, 2 white bras. I held one of the bras up with an obvious look of disgust on my face. As a grub you are only allowed to wear a training bra, Fiona told me. Later, if you continue with feminine clothing, you get to wear breast forms, and she hefted her own protruding bosom. Dr. McPherson thinks it important that you learn what it feels like to wear a bra from the very beginning of your gender studies, this being the garment that will be most different from anything you have worn before. Fiona next turned her attention to the other packages that were part of my luggage. The first box revealed a shoulder-length, mid-brown wig and a polystyrene wig stand. The color of the wig exactly matched my own hair color. "Wow, this is a good quality wig," Fiona exclaimed, holding it up. Many of the boys only have cheap, artificial ones for this first half term. Your mom has pushed the boat out and bought you one made with real hair. She must be expecting you to continue with the program." "Over my dead body," I replied. The second box was large but quite thin. Inside was. It contained a green print dress and contrasting cardigan. "Oh, this is sweet," Fiona enthused. We all wear school uniform Monday to Saturday, but on Sundays we are allowed to dress up prettily. "Oh, how wonderful," I thought sarcastically. Another box held a pair of brown court shoes with a 2-inch heel, whilst the final box contained silky nylon knickers trimmed with lace and packets of sheer hosiery. These last made me blush yet again. "Right, let me show you where the bathrooms are and then you can get changed," Fiona announced briskly. She led me out of the dormitory, down another corridor and into a large bathroom equipped with one freestanding bath, a row of 4 wash basins, and 3 shower cubicles. "The toilets are just across the corridor," Fiona informed me. "Now let's get you ready. Strip off and let me see how much body hair we are going to have to remove." I was, of course, accustomed to being naked amongst fellow boy pupils from my previous school. After games or gym we always shared common facilities. However, although I knew that underneath her clothes Fiona was a boy just like me, the fact that she looked so convincing as a girl in her skirt and heeled shoes made me embarrassed to undress in front of her. Fiona guessed my predicament and giggled. "Oh, come on, don't be shy. It's not as if you have anything I don't." Reluctantly I stripped off and stood with my hands across my crotch, trying not to cringe as Fiona subjected me to a critical examination. Not too bad," she mused. "Not very much body hair, and you have great long legs that will look fabulous when you wear a miniskirt." Fiona took a bottle out of a wall cupboard. "This is hair remover," she told me. "Rub it into your skin all over your body. Just avoid your face. I'll help with any area you can't reach." By now, well beyond embarrassment, I accepted Fiona's help to ensure every inch of my body with the exception of my pubic hair, which was pretty sparse anyway, was well coated with the hair removal cream. I then had to stand there for several minutes until the itching on my skin became unbearable. Only then would Fiona allow me to shower off the cream. As I did so, I watched what little body hair I did have vanishing down the plug hole. When I had toweled myself dry, pat. "Don't rub," was Fiona's instruction. She passed me another bottle of lotion. "This is a moisturizer that will neutralize any remaining traces of the nair," she said. The lotion was soothing and I spread it lavishly over my body. The only downside was the strong, floral perfume, distinctly feminine. It reminded me of the cosmetics my mother uses. Fiona took a white toweling bathrobe from a cupboard and passed it across to me. I was grateful to be able to cover my nakedness. We returned to the dormitory and my heart sank as I realized the moment had arrived when I would have to dress in the girly clothes lying on my bed. Actually, the cotton knickers weren't too bad. Apart from being somewhat snug in the crotch, they weren't too dissimilar to my regular underpants. "Tuck your cock back between your legs," Fiona advised. "Later you might want to try wearing a gaff like I do, but this will do for now." I subsequently discovered that a gaff is some version of a medieval torture garment designed to squeeze your nuts out of existence. Next, Fiona had me sit whilst she showed me how to put on a pair of tights without lathering them. This involved rolling down the legs until they resemble a pair of donuts and then, having got them onto your feet, indulging in a bout of self-wrestling to work them carefully up over your knees and hips until they securely reach your waist. Having achieved this state, Fiona passed me one of the bras. I didn't know where to look as she helped me slip my arms through the straps and fastened the clips behind my back. "You'll get the hang of this in a day or so," she reassured me. The constriction on my chest felt distinctly odd, but not uncomfortable. A cream blouse was next. I had trouble fastening the buttons on the wrong side, but apart from that it felt Oklahoma. Stepping into a tartan skirt took some courage as Fiona showed me how to zip it up at the side and settle it into place. I managed to put the shoes on without help, and the blazer was a dawdle except for, once again, the buttons being the reverse of what I was used to. This only left the wig. Whilst I had been dealing with the shoes and blazer, Fiona had shaken out the wig and brushed out a few tangles. She had me sit whilst she aligned the wig correctly on my head, making sure all my own hair was out sight. The sensation of hair falling beside my face and onto my shoulders was most peculiar, and the wig itself was quite heavy on my head. "There, now you quite look the part," Fiona announced, brightly. "Come and have a look at yourself in the mirror." I approached the mirror with trepidation, expecting to look an idiot. To my surprise, I actually looked quite nice. The reflection in the mirror was clearly me, but I did look like an average girl and not some freak. The fact that I was slightly built obviously helped, but whereas this had made me look awkward and gawky as a boy, dressed as a girl, I now looked slim and tall. As Fiona had prophesied, my legs were very shapely in their navy tights. The hem of my skirt fell about 4 inches above my knee, and with a higher waistband, made my legs seem even longer than they actually are. I stood in front of the mirror totally gobsmacked by my transformation. I didn't make a particularly pretty girl, but I wouldn't stand out in a crowd as a cross-dressed boy, and for that I was very grateful. "Come on down to the 6th form common room," Fiona announced, "and I'll introduce you to some of the others in Lavender House." This was it, the moment when I had to publicly accept that for the next few weeks I was going to have to behave and be treated as a girl. Not a prospect I was looking forward to. When we arrived at the 6th form common room, it proved to be an attractive, well-lit room with plenty of comfortable sofas and chairs, a few desks, and facilities for making drinks and light snacks. There were about 12 people present, most of them wearing skirts. Fiona explained that there were 26th formers in Lavender House, half in the lower 6th and half in the upper. She quickly introduced me to a few of my fellow pupils in the lower 6th. It did not take long for me to discover that I was the only new pupil entering the school at 6th form level, the others having progressed through the lower forms of the school, and, for them, this cross-dressing was merely a rite of passage, whereas for me it was a major issue. It did not take me many minutes before I came to the conclusion that my interests would be best served if I avoided making a fuss and simply accepted my peculiar state as normal. Fiona introduced me to a couple of pupils who would be in the lower 6th with me. Brianna, née Brian, and Francine, née Frank, were very helpful in helping me understand how the school works. There are 2 forms of 20 pupils each in both the lower and upper 6ths. Half the students are majoring in sciences and half in arts. I am in arts. Having come up through the school from age 9, they were both totally comfortable with dressing as girls for this half term. "Then I intend to revert to boy mode," Brian told me. "I am planning to sauté a girl, said Francine. "All the best opportunities for making your mark as a 6th former lie with being one of the girls." Brian grinned. "Yes, that is true, but by becoming a drone you avoid all the hard work." It wasn't long before the bell sounded for dinner and we all trooped through to the dining hall. As it transpired, the food was pretty decent and a definite improvement over what had been served at my previous school. After dinner we returned to the common room. There I met the rest of the boys with whom I would be spending the next 2 years. Irrespective of how they were dressed, I thought them to be a pretty good crowd. Obviously, all those of us in the lower 6th were attired as girls. In the upper 6th there were 5 girls and 5 boys. I tried to make a point of saying hi to all of them. At 9 p.m., a couple of the upper 6th girls disappeared. Fiona explained, they are prefects and it is their responsibility to ensure all the lower form boys are in bed and lights out. In the 6th form we are allowed to stay up until 11 p.m. Soon it was our turn to retire for the night and I made my way back to the dormitory with Francine and Brianna. I learned they were in the same room as me. It felt odd taking off my feminine clothes and putting on a pair of white cotton pajamas, trimmed with lace and printed with pink flowers. However, after all the excitements of the day I was exhausted and fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. The next morning Francine shaking my shoulder awaked me. "Come on," she urged, "if you don't hurry up all the hot water will have gone." I shot out of bed, grabbed my toilet bag and towel and hurried to the bathroom. I was in luck, there was still plenty of hot water and I managed to grab a vacant shower cubicle. Somewhat to my chagrin, I have not yet needed to start shaving regularly. However, on reflection, in the present circumstances that was a definite bonus. Returning to the dormitory I put on a pair of clean knickers. Having only worn them for a couple of hours the previous day, I reckoned that my tights and blouse would cope with a second outing. Brianna told me that I should wear my sweater rather than the blazer, so I was soon fully, if femininely, attired and after checking my wig was on straight, I headed down for breakfast. Then it was time for my first class. That day, and on all subsequent ones, I found the teaching at St. Hilda's excellent. The teachers were engaged and enthusiastic about their subjects. As 6th formers we were expected to think more for ourselves and I enjoyed the cut and thrust of debate and challenge. It was my objective to try for a place at Oxford University where I wanted to read English, and I knew I would have to get very good grades at A-level. I was thus motivated to work hard. The fact I was enjoying studying was a definite plus. Whilst in class I became so engrossed in my studies that I totally forgot that I was dressed as a girl and my skirt and tights became a complete irrelevance. It wasn't the same at weekends, however, as I discovered on my first Sunday at St. Hilda's. On Sundays chapel was compulsory if you were nominally Christian. We had pupils of other faiths in the school and they quietly worshipped in their own ways at the appropriate times. This meant they got Sunday morning off, lucky them. For the rest of us it was Sunday best for chapel at 10 a.m. Naturally for us girls this meant pretty frocks, nylons and high heels. I thought I looked quite cute in my green dress and cardigan, and my legs certainly looked shapely in sheer hose. It was the heels I had a problem with. I couldn't understand why real girls positively chose to wear these instruments of torture that pinched my toes, made my feet ache, and threatened to twist my ankle at any moment. Fiona laughed at my struggles and assured me that within a couple of weeks I would be as smooth and as elegant walking in heels as she was. In the event, what she said turned out to be true, but getting there was a bit of a struggle. After chapel and lunch, the rest of Sunday was free time. This gave all us pupils time to write home, enjoy a bit of television or reading, indulge in video gaming, or simply lounge around. For a few of us swats it usually meant catching up with overdue assignments and homework. The only time during the week when the wearing of girls' clothing was not required was for games. In spite of the eccentricities of the 6th form, St. Hilda's is still a boys' independent school and hence rugby is the sport of choice. As wigs and breast forms are not conducive to such a vigorous contact sport, we reverted to standard, male rugby kit. Those boys, who had, like Fiona, grown their own hair long, stuffed their tresses inside scrum caps. There was a fair amount of moaning after games as they tried to ease out the tangles and restore their hairstyles. Those girls who chose to play hockey kept their wigs and forms on and wore female games kit. For gym we all remained in cross-gender role, with an emphasis on aerobic activities and dance for us girls. As it happened, I was quite a good rugby player. At my previous school, Loughborough, I had played scrum half for the under-16s. When the St. Hilda's Games Master discovered this, he took particular interest in my performance. I learned that the previous season St. Hilda's had an especially talented scrum half who had been instrumental in the team winning most of its matches against other schools. This boy had left at the end of the summer term, and there was no obvious successor coming through the lower sixth. My arrival, therefore, was seen as a godsend. The coach watched me play in the first couple of inter-house matches and then told me, to my great delight, I would be filling the role of scrum half in the overall school team. It will be clear from this account that I settled into St. Hilda's more easily than I could have imagined. From being upset and angry at being sent there, within a few weeks I felt quite at home. It was therefore not surprising that the weeks sped past rapidly, and it was with something of a shock that I realized the half-term weekend was approaching when I would have to decide my future at St. Hilda's. My first instinct was to stick with my original plan and revert to the male role. But this would mean I would become a drone, and these were sort of regarded as second-class citizens by the rest of the sixth form. Also, to be eligible to be considered as a potential prefect or sports captain, you had to be enrolled in the gender studies program. It was all a bit of a dilemma, and I kept putting off making any firm decision. Half-term comprised the middle weekend of term plus the Friday before and the Monday after. On the Thursday evening, when we returned to our dormitory, we lower sixth boys found that Tom, the school handyman, had retrieved the suitcases containing our boy clothes from his storeroom and had put them beside our beds. The idea was that we would all declare our selection of future role by the gender of the clothes we wore down to breakfast on the Friday morning. I still couldn't bring myself to make a firm decision and fell asleep to troubled and disturbing dreams. Put things off though I may, morning inevitably dawned and I sat up in bed switching my gaze from my boy's suitcase to my bureau of Trisha's clothes. Still undecided, I went for my morning ablutions, returned to the dormitory, dressed without further thought or consideration, and went down for breakfast. Fiona squealed with delight as I walked into the dining room. "Oh, you have decided to remain as Trisha. I hoped you would, but wasn't sure because you have been so indecisive these last few days." Yes, I was wearing my green dress and wig. Trisha was here to stay for the rest of my time at St. Hilda's. I was only one of 3 boys from Lavender House who elected to stay on the gender studies program. The other 7 automatically became drones. Apparently, the 3 of us comprised a lower number than usual. Fiona told me that normally, as in her year, the ratio was roughly 50 to 50. The fact that we were so few in number meant that more responsibility fell to the 3 of us. In addition to myself, there was Francine, who had become a particular friend, and Geraldine/Gary, who I knew less well. Brianna had, as he had said all along, reverted to being Brian. After breakfast, Fiona dragged me aside. "I'm so pleased you decided to stay on the program," she started. "I would very much like you to help me with running Lavender House. I need to devote more time to my studies if I am to get the A-level grades I need. Being head of house has been more time-consuming than I thought. It would an enormous help if you were willing to become my secretary. Basically, that would mean that you would take responsibility for ensuring that the prefect's rotas are up to date, making sure the common room is kept tidy and that tea, coffee, and that sort of thing is regularly restocked. None of the tasks are particularly onerous, but they do take up a fair bit of time." Well, I could hardly refuse her. I had been a worker bee for less than an hour, and I already had my first taste of the responsibility that goes with that role. After she had convinced me to become her secretary, Fiona insisted I now needed to think more seriously about my role as a girl. "Until now you only needed things to last you for a few weeks," she told me. "But the few female clothes you have aren't going to last you for the rest of this year, let alone next. We are going to have to go shopping. Half-term was the first time we had been allowed to leave the school premises. I knew a coach had been laid on to take those who wanted to go into the nearby town, but I hadn't been planning to go. Now, however, Fiona was insistent. You can't argue with me, I won't allow it. It is imperative you buy some new casual outfits as well as a few pieces of jewelry and some makeup. She wouldn't take no for an answer, so it was off to the school office to explain why I needed to withdraw a substantial chunk of the pocket money my parents had left for me. Mrs. Jenkins, the school secretary, was obviously accustomed to such requests at this time of year and smiled indulgently as she handed over the cash. Not long afterward I found myself on the bus heading for town. The town nearest to the school wasn't large, but it did have a decent range of shops and Fiona knew exactly where to go. But won't they think it odd for an obviously cross-dressed boy to be openly buying girls' clothes? I inquired nervously. Fiona laughed. You are forgetting that boys from St. Hilda's have been buying dresses here for years, she reminded me. All the shops are cool about it, and, after all, as far as they are concerned, every sale is extra profit. Now you are going to need at least 2 more dresses, a couple of skirts, a few tops, and shoes to match. Oh, and a coat and a decent-sized handbag. Then there is makeup, jewelry, and proper bras. Now you are officially a worker. You are allowed to progress from training bras and to start wearing breast forms. You won't be able to buy those here, but the school keeps a few pairs in stock to help new girls get started. What about trousers? I moaned, can't I at least wear trousers or jeans at the weekends? Sorry, but no, was Fiona's crisp reply. Mr. McPherson is adamant that us girls wear skirts at all times. I know real women spend more time in trousers than skirts, but he insists we need to learn as much about behaving femininely as possible, so trousers are banned. By now my head was reeling. Fiona dragged me into a discount store. Most of the stuff they sell here are ends of lines or last year's styles, she explained. Clothes cost a fraction of what they are elsewhere. We headed for the racks of dresses. The store didn't waste money on expensive displays, their clothes were hung simply on racks, categorized by function and size. We headed for day dresses. I should think you are about a size 10, Fiona said, eyeing me critically. Well, that is what it says on the label on the dress I'm wearing, I replied. We dived into the racks showing size 10. As a boy, I never realized that shopping could be so complicated. I quickly found a dress I thought quite pretty, pulled it off its hanger, and thought we were done. But by no means. Fiona patiently explained about the need to consider different styles and colors, taking account of one's own complexion and hair. Slowly, I got to grips with what she was telling me. Eventually, between us, we found 4 dresses that Fiona thought possible and headed off to the changing rooms to try them on. As Fiona had prophesied, no one questioned why 2 boys were going into the women's changing area. We found a free cubicle and I tried on the different dresses. We finally settled on 2, a knee-length one with t-shirt type top and full skirt in turquoise and navy, and a more fitted, floral-patterned one. Fiona explained that both these styles looked good on me but were not too dressy for girls of our age. I loved both immediately. Then it was back to the racks to look for skirts and tops. I eventually, with much prompting from Fiona, settled on a tartan miniskirt and a slightly longer gray one. Mr. McPherson doesn't mind us showing a bit of leg occasionally, Fiona explained, but he doesn't allow anything too extreme. These will be fine so long as we find appropriate tops. Which we did. I was already feeling exhausted, but Fiona was adamant that I needed several more things, so it was off to other shops. I ended up with some sweet lingerie. Fiona allowed me one set in silky burgundy, but then insisted, "You will need simpler items for everyday wear." The items she suggested were practical and less attractive, but for me it was still a thrill buying my own female underwear. Then shoes. I already had a pair of slip-ons that went with my school uniform, but Fiona insisted I need at least 2, if not 3, others to go with my new clothes. Here's what we ended up with, nothing too extreme, although we did have fun trying on shoes with much higher, spike heels. Fiona advised me, get a bit more experience of what it is like to wear heels for a while before going for those ankle breakers. Fiona's final piece of advice was, as we are entering the winter period, I suggest you buy yourself a decent coat and umbrella, one that will fit into a handbag. So I did, and then, of course, there was the question of the handbag itself. Go for a tote bag, Fiona advised. They hold loads and go with pretty much anything. We found a nice black one in faux leather that I could carry either over my arm or shoulder. Next on Fiona's agenda was makeup. So it was into a department store and over to the makeup counters. I use their own brand most of the time, Fiona told me. It is much cheaper than the named products and seems just as good. I followed her advice and was soon equipped with a basic makeup kit. The sales assistant was totally unfazed at serving a cross-dressed boy and was extremely helpful in advising what colors and tones work best for my complexion. Final stop for today, announced Fiona enthusiastically, dragging me across to the jewelry counters. I just adore shopping, don't you? She inquired. I had to confess I was enjoying myself much more than I had anticipated. Earrings, you must have earrings, Fiona said excitedly. I started to look at the small stand of clip-on ones. No, said Fiona crossly, you are going to have to get your ears pierced. All girls of our age have had that done, and there are many more earrings than to choose from. She wouldn't take no for an answer, so, in spite of my protests, I found myself sitting on a chair whilst an assistant marked my earlobes to show where she was proposing to pierce them. One set of holes will be fine for now, Fiona announced authoritatively. Later you can think about wearing studs higher up your ear. One hole will be more than sufficient, I thought quietly to myself. Pop, pop, 2 sharp jolts of pain and the job was done. I now sported a small gold stud in each ear. The sales assistant explained how I would need to clean the holes with a light alcohol solution for a few days until the piercings had healed. After that you can take out the studs and start wearing other earrings, she told me. With Fiona's enthusiastic help, I selected about half a dozen pairs of earrings, nothing extreme, but pretty and in a variety of styles suitable for someone of my age. After the earrings, I picked out a couple of simple necklaces that Fiona assured me would go well with my new outfits, and a couple of cheap bangles for my wrists. Oh, and you will need one of these, said Fiona, my treat, as she handed me a simple gold-colored, lady's watch. At long last even Fiona seemed to have exhausted her love of shopping. My brain was reeling and I was desperate for something to drink. So we retired to a coffee bar and ordered 2 cappuccinos. Well, what do you think? Fiona inquired excitedly. I'm wrung out, I confessed, but I have enjoyed picking out all these pretty things. I just can't believe how much we have bought. At my last school one suit, a smart pair of trousers and a couple of pairs of jeans was all I needed. Welcome to girls' world, giggled Fiona. We finished our coffees and made our way back to where we had to meet the school bus. Other students, both boys and girls, were coming back from their half-term outing and I noticed with amusement that most of the girls were as heavily loaded with bags and packages as I was. Back at school I was happy to kick off my shoes and collapse on the bed in my dormitory. I wasn't allowed to rest for long as both Francine and Geraldine had also been out shopping and were excited to compare purchases. Soon the 3 of us were undertaking an impromptu fashion show, each squealing with excitement over the other's purchases. I have to confess that had anyone told me 3 months ago that I would get so much fun out of shopping for dresses, I would have thought they were mad. It just goes to show what changes a few short weeks can bring. Before supper, Fiona insisted I go down to the bursar's office to be fitted for a pair of falsies. Mrs. Gresham, the bursar, is a middle-aged lady who always seems to be able to find time to deal with all the various problems we students bring to her. She was, therefore, totally unfazed by requests to borrow a pair of breast forms. "What size are you aiming at, dear?" was her only comment. I explained that I had just purchased some 34B bras. Mrs. Gresham eyed me critically. "Yes, I think that is about right for a girl of your age and build," she said, thoughtfully. "Slip your top off and let's see what we can do." It felt a bit odd standing there in front of a real woman clad only in a bra above the waist, but Mrs. Gresham showed no sign of surprise. She took 2 square boxes from one of her cupboards and produced 2 very realistic, silicone breast forms. She slipped them into bra cups. They felt distinctly cold and I shivered involuntarily. Mrs. Gresham smiled. "I know they feel cold at first," she explained, "but they soon warm up to body temperature." She adjusted how the forms were lying and, in the process, pulled some of my own chest flesh above them so that it appeared that the breasts was my own. Looking down, I could see real cleavage. It was very exciting. I was surprised at how heavy the forms were and the weight on my chest. "Now you realize why it is essential for women to make sure they wear correctly fitting bras," Mrs. Gresham told me. "This is just the sort of lesson your gender swap experience is expected to teach." I slipped my top back on and, for the first time, experienced the tenting of the front of my sweater. "Run along, dear," Mrs. Gresham said, smiling. "I'm sure you want to show off your new assets to your friends. You are the first girl to have come to me for a bosom this year, but I'm sure you won't be the last." I returned to Lavender House common room and Fiona squealed with delight at my new, womanly shape. I noticed Geraldine making a swift exit from the room as I explained how helpful Mrs. Gresham had been and, before supper, she was back sporting an impressive rack herself. After supper, we sixth form girls settled down in front of the common room television set and loaded a chick flick DVD into the player. "You youngsters are welcome to stay and watch," Fiona told the junior school boys, "but if you do, just keep quiet." Some boys wandered off grumbling, but I noticed, with amusement, that quite a few remained and settled down to watch the film with evident enjoyment. Clearly some in the junior school could hardly wait to get into the sixth form and become bees themselves. For the rest of the half-term I mooched around with my friends, walking around the school grounds, gossiping, and generally relaxing. I noticed that walking in the rougher parts of the school grounds was a very different experience wearing skirts than when I had worn jeans. Nettles and brambles suddenly became much more serious obstacles, and getting over stiles necessitated a very careful approach if you wanted to preserve your modesty. It was good to have a few days off lessons to recharge batteries. All too soon it was back to lessons and the second half of the term. I have already mentioned that I had been selected scrum half for the school first 15 and, now that the autumn was well set in, we started our annual round of fixtures against other schools. As we played the same schools year after year, the fact that over half of our team arrived at the match wearing skirts fazed few of our opponents. Anyway, once on the pitch our team was wearing the same kit as the opposition, and after that no quarter was given. We did receive a bit of light joshing at tea after most matches, but in the main it was good-humored and I learned to take it in good part. However, I was somewhat thrown the first time a boy from another school asked me if I would like to go out with him. Fiona explained that this was fairly common, as in all-boy boarding schools it was almost impossible for pupils to get experience of interacting with girls, and we provided a useful halfway house. Incidentally, I did not accept the offer of a date. After a couple of matches, our rugger coach asked me if I would take on responsibility for training sessions with boys from the lower school who showed promise as potential scrum halves. He wanted to avoid the embarrassment that would have been caused to the team had I not turned up at an opportune time. Of course, I was delighted to take on the role, as it was another example of how my decision to become a worker bee was paying off and enabling me to gain experience in positions of responsibility. I was enjoying the second half of the autumn term until one day a letter arrived from my parents. I had been looking forward to flying out to Bangkok to join them over Christmas. However, their letter explained that unfortunately, owing to the arrival of an important Chinese trade delegation in Thailand, they would be tied up for the whole of the Christmas period and, therefore, they hoped I wouldn't be too disappointed about spending the holidays at school. Disappointed, I was furious. My parents have always put their work before me, but this was the worst yet. It wasn't that I was unhappy at school, quite the reverse in fact, but I still wanted to get away for the holidays, and whilst my parents may not be missing me, I do miss them. There wasn't even the choice of going to stay in our family house in Sussex. This had been let when my parents went to Thailand and, hence, was no longer available to me. Later on the day this letter arrived, I was summoned to the headmaster's office. He had received a similar letter to mine. Mr. McPherson was kindness itself. He realized how upset I must be and went out of his way to try and calm me down. "I know this is a big disappointment," he said, "but you are not the only boy to be in this predicament. There will be about 6 of you staying on over the holidays. I can promise that Mrs. McPherson and I will do our utmost to ensure you have an enjoyable Christmas." Well, there was nothing I could do to alter the situation, so I thanked him and went off to seek commiserations from my friends. Fiona, Francine, and Geraldine all sympathized with my predicament. Fiona in particular was very upset for me. "I would invite you to come and spend Christmas with my family," she said, "but, unfortunately, we are committed to going to my grandparents' place this year." So, that was it. I was faced with having to spend Christmas at school. Chapter 2 Lower 6th The Christmas holiday breaking up at the end of term was hard as I watched most of the boys and girls being collected by their parents and going off happily to their homes for 3 weeks. When everyone except for us 6 had departed, Mr. McPherson asked us to move our belongings from our individual dormitories into one in Clover House. Clover House happens to be in the same block as the headmaster's apartment. Mr. McPherson explained that as we would be spending Christmas with him and his wife, it made more sense for everyone to be together. As he had told me, there were 6 of us staying on, me, a drone from the upper 6th called Trevor who I knew slightly, 2 fifth formers, 1 from the 4th form and 1 from the 3rd. I felt especially sorry for Clive, the 3rd former. He was only 12 and a half and seemed so desperately sad. I tried to cheer him up a bit. Mr. McPherson noticed this and took me aside. "I'm glad you are taking the initiative, Tricia," he said. "Although Trevor is a year older than you, he has chosen to be a drone and therefore, as the only worker bee in the party, it falls to you to become temporary prefect for the holidays." This was promotion indeed, and I felt a little better myself about having to stay on at school. "As prefect you will have your own room next to the dormitory the others will be in," Mr. McPherson explained. "I look to you to keep order and spirits up." Term had ended about a week before Christmas Day and the next few days were busy as we all pitched in and helped the McPhersons prepare for the festivities. I soon discovered that being a prefect wasn't all sweetness and light. I had to resolve disputes and make sure that all the boys took their fair share of the work. I had a bit of a run-in with Trevor after a couple of days when it became clear that he thought, as someone in the upper 6th, he should enjoy a privileged position. I swiftly put him straight and was pleased that I was able to sort things out without involving Mr. McPherson. By Christmas Eve the common room in Clover House had been transformed. The clutter left by departing boys had been cleared away and the whole room given a thorough clean, and did it need it? We had put up and decorated an enormous Christmas tree and imported a dining table from the McPherson's apartment that would seat all 8 of us. Late afternoon on Christmas Eve, I was helping Mrs. McPherson set out the table with silver cutlery and crystal glasses. A snowy linen cloth covered the polished mahogany and candles were set ready to illuminate our festivities. Mrs. McPherson explained that it was their custom to start Christmas celebrations on the eve and not wait until Christmas Day itself. Now run along, Tricia, and get yourself prettied up. I can finish off here, Mrs. McPherson told me. Have you chosen your party dresses for tonight and tomorrow? I had to confess this had never occurred to me and, in fact, I did not have one party dress, let alone a choice. Oh, you poor dear, giggled Mrs. McPherson, that will never do. Come with me and I'll help you choose something. At this school we are never short of a selection of female clothing to loan out. As we walked across to one of the storerooms, Mrs. McPherson confided in me. This is another good lesson for you to learn, Tricia. We women have to plan ahead about what we are going to wear. Men can just grab a clean shirt and a tidy suit, but we have to think about the nature of the event and how dressy we need to be, what we may have worn before, what other women are likely to wear, and what menfolk do we have to impress. The latter is particularly important if you are hoping to get off with someone special. This last remark caused me to blush a bright red. Mrs. McPherson gently squeezed my arm. It's okay, Tricia, I'm only teasing, but there is truth in what I say and it is important you learn from these experiences. That is what your cross-dressing is all about. And, of course, some of our girls choose to remain in that role even after they have left school. Fortunately, just then we arrived at the clothing store, so I was spared further embarrassment. The storeroom was a treasure trove of female garments. Mrs. McPherson showed me where the rack of party dresses was and stood back whilst I looked through them. I would suggest you look for 3 or 4 dresses, she advised. We have a number of days of celebrations and it would never do for you to turn up wearing the same dress twice. Why don't you pick 3 shorter dresses and a couple of long formal ones? If you change your mind about what you like, and that is our prerogative as ladies. Just ask me and we can come back for another look. Nervously, I started to rummage through the rack of clothes. It contained a positive cornucopia of fashion. Mrs. McPherson smiled as she watched me rummage excitedly through the numerous dresses. I just couldn't decide which ones to pick. They were all so lovely. In the end, I did manage to select 6, 1 full-length gown in turquoise faux silk, 3 knee-length cocktail dresses, 1 black, 1 navy blue and 1 pink. I know the black and navy dresses are very similar, but I just couldn't decide which one I liked better, so Mrs. McPherson sensible suggested I take both. And finally, 2 pretty day dresses for less formal occasions. Between us, Mrs. McPherson and I carried my selection back to my room in Clover House. You will need to get your skates on, Mrs. McPherson counseled. We will be sitting down to dinner in an hour. I suggest one of the shorter dresses for tonight and save the long one for Christmas Day. I had had enough experience of being a temporary girl to know that a mere hour wasn't really long enough to get ready for my debut at a formal party, but I determined to do my best. No time for a leisurely bath, a quick shower would have to suffice. Before hopping in the shower, I brushed out my wig and put it on its stand. I also applied a liberal amount of Nair, as I didn't want my debut to be marred by any unsightly body hair. Once clean and smooth, I slathered a floral body lotion all over my skin and then sat down at my dressing table with my makeup kit set out before me. If I do say so myself, I think I made a rather good job of my makeup. An application of blue and gray eyeshadow was complemented with mascaraed false eyelashes and the liberal use of eyeliner. Nothing too extreme. I didn't want to try and appear older than my years, well, at least not too much older. A little blusher to my cheekbones and a pink lipstick completed the effect. I was determined to feel as feminine as possible for this very special evening, so chose my silky, burgundy bra and panties. 10 denier black tights made my legs look long and shiny. Finally, my dress. I picked up the navy blue one and gingerly stepped into it and zipped up the back. It fitted perfectly. I carefully settled my wig on my head and arranged it so that it fell mostly to one side, as in the picture above. They enabled me to show off my sparkly, dangly earrings. I slipped my stocking feet into my black high heel pumps with the 3-inch heel and the strap round my ankle. Unfortunately, my pair of blue heels was the wrong shade to go with this dress. I glanced at my watch. It had taken me just 55 minutes to get ready. I had made it on time. I hurried down to the common room. The other 5 pupils were already there, all smartly dressed in gray or navy boys' suits. Clive, the 12-year-old, came across and told me how pretty I looked. I wish I was old enough to dress as a girl, he confided. It seems a lifetime having to wait until I get into the 6th form, and I am desperate to look pretty, although I could never look as good as you. We both blushed at his lavish compliments. I decided I would have a word with Mr. McPherson to see if an exception to the dressing rule could be made in Clive's case. After all, it was the holidays, and technically we were no longer at school. If I could get permission for him to release his female side, it would undoubtedly be the best Christmas present I could give him. Just then Mr. and Mrs. McPherson entered the room. My jaw dropped. Mrs. McPherson was wearing a fabulous fuchsia-fitted gown, but her husband was equally glamorously arrayed. My headmaster was dressed in a gray silk, full-length evening gown, beautifully trimmed with lace and a matching bolero jacket. He grinned when he saw the expression on my face. I don't know why you look so surprised, Tricia. After all, I was a pupil in the 6th form of this school as well, you know. I too came to love my feminine side. It is just unfortunate that I can only indulge my love of pretty clothing out of term time. I'm sorry, sir, I stammered. I guess it just never occurred to me that some boys continue their female experience into adulthood. Oh yes, Mr. McPherson replied, several old boys routinely cross-dress and 1 or 2 even live full-time as women. I could name a couple of society hostesses who are frequently featured in the news who are old boys of St. Hilda's. I won't mention their names, of course. Discretion is part of what we expect pupils to learn whilst at school. By the way, he continued, I think we could drop the sir for the time being. For the rest of Christmas, please call me Amanda. And, on the basis of equality, you can address me by my Christian name, Mrs. McPherson added. It is Caroline. Now, shall we sit down to dinner? Amanda suggested. He took her place at one end of the table and Caroline sat at the other. John and Cecil, the 2 5th formers, you can serve us this evening, Amanda continued. We all took our places. Trevor actually seated me. And John and Cecil set to serving the first course. The meal was delicious and there was wine for Amanda, Caroline, Trevor, and I. Just 1 glass, mind, Caroline cautioned. The younger boys had a choice of soft drinks. It was a delicious meal. The kitchen staff have excelled themselves this year, Amanda announced contentedly when we had finally finished. I trust they will do as well tomorrow with the turkey. After dinner we retired to Amanda and Caroline's sitting room for coffee and chocolates. As we sat and chatted, I took the opportunity to have a quiet word with Amanda. As you have made it clear that you are no longer headmaster for a few days, I started, would you mind if Clive joined us as one of the girls? He is desperate to be allowed to wear a dress. Amanda grinned, I think one last official announcement from the headmaster might be in order." She rose and called the room to order. "At Trisha's request, I have decided that any of you boys below 6th form level who would like to become girls for the next few days will be allowed to do so. If that is your wish, please have a word with Caroline, and I am sure she will be able to sort you out some clothing appropriate for your age." Clive could hardly contain his excitement and was soon in deep conversation with Caroline. Trevor looked scornful, if a bit wistful. He had already committed himself to being a drone. John and Cecil were clearly talking about what to do, whilst Philip, the 4th former, quickly aligned himself with Trevor. In the end, Clive and John elected to join the ladies, and Trevor, Cecil, and Philip decided to remain male. At about 10 o'clock, Caroline announced that it was time for bed. "It's Christmas Day tomorrow, remember, and we don't want anyone with a sore head in the morning." We pupils said good night to Amanda and Caroline, and I led everyone up to the dormitory. Clive was so excited I had to go in and warn him that if he didn't calm down it wasn't too late to rescind permission for him to dress as a girl. This threat had the desired effect, and soon the room was quiet. On Christmas morning, Trevor and I arose first, as had previously been agreed, and went down to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. One of the school cooks was coming in to prepare our Christmas dinner, but it seemed unfair to ask her to look after breakfast as well. Between us, Trevor and I cooked up a pile of bacon, sausage, tomato, and mushrooms. We weren't going to eat dinner until late afternoon, so we knew everyone would want to stoke up at breakfast. Whilst breakfast was cooking, I took a tray of tea up to Mr. and Mrs. McPherson's bedroom. I knocked on the door and was invited to enter. Caroline and Amanda were still in bed. Amanda's face was wiped clean of makeup and her wig was on its stand on the dressing table. However, in spite of her short, masculine haircut, he still looked feminine in a lovely peach-colored silk and lace nightdress. "Thank you, Trisha, that is very thoughtful," Amanda said. "Breakfast will be ready in half an hour, sir." "Sorry, I mean Amanda," I stammered. Amanda grinned. "It's okay, I don't mind if you slip up occasionally. It must be very confusing to see your headmaster like this and in bed." Thankful, I scurried away back to the kitchen. Everyone was down for breakfast in good time and our food was much enjoyed. After breakfast, Clive and John went off with Caroline in search of female clothing, whilst the rest of us layered up with jeans, sweaters, and coats ready for a walk. An exception had been made to the no trousers for girls rule for the duration of the holiday. It was a beautiful sunny morning, crisp but not cold in the sunshine. We walked onto the moors surrounding the school and tramped along for a couple of hours. Clive was a delight to watch as he skipped happily around in his girls' jeans with sequins on the pockets and pink Wellington boots. After our walk, we changed into day clothes. I wore the pink dress with the square-cut neckline and lounged around the common room. Mrs. Cullen, the cook, arrived with a tray of coffee and Christmas cake, and we enjoyed these whilst opening our presents which had been piled under the tree. My parents hadn't sent me anything exciting, a check and a couple of books about Thailand, but it was fun watching the others getting excited over what they received. At 4 o'clock we all went back to our rooms to dress ready for Christmas dinner. Naturally, I wore the turquoise, full-length gown I had selected from the school's clothing store. When I had finished putting on my makeup and had pinned my wig into an updo, I thought I looked quite sophisticated. On returning to the common room, everyone else had also made a major effort to look his or her best for our Christmas dinner. Caroline, Amanda, and John, now Lucy, were all wearing long gowns. Sissy wore a calf-length dress appropriate to her tender years. She looked divinely sweet. Mrs. Cullen's Christmas dinner was every bit as tasty as we had hoped, and we all enjoyed a fun evening. After dinner, we settled down to watch the big film on television. This year it was James Bond's Skyfall. I hadn't seen it in the cinema and found it very exciting. Then it was time for bed. Most of us had a lie-in on Boxing Day. Cecil and Susie, Clive, were on breakfast duty, but today we all settled for porridge and toast, as we would be eating our main meal at lunchtime. I felt in need of a bit of exercise and asked whether anyone else was up for a walk. The other pupils all declined, as they wanted to look at their Christmas presents. I decided to go anyway and, somewhat to my surprise, Amanda asked if she could join me. The two of us set off for the moors well wrapped up against the winter weather. I wore jeans, my camel coat, a woolly hat and my Wellington boots. Amanda looked very fetching in a thick tweed skirt and wool blouson. "There is a rather nice walk over this way," Amanda suggested. "It overlooks some pretty views, but there aren't too many ups and downs." We walked companionably together for a while before Amanda broke the silence. "How are you getting on at St. Hilda's, Tricia?" she inquired. "Actually, to my surprise, I am enjoying being on the gender program very much," I replied. At first I was very angry with my parents for springing this on me without talking it through first, but as the term has gone on I am finding it very comfortable being a girl. "I'm pleased," said Amanda. "I have been keeping an eye on your progress and you have settled in much better than most boys who only join us in the sixth form. It is harder for new entrants to the school to accept our traditions if they haven't grown up with them." We continued to chat companionably as if Amanda was an older sister or aunt, rather than my headmaster. I realized that he and Caroline were probably only in their early 40s and could still remember what it is like being a school pupil. It was really easy chatting to her, and I found myself sharing feelings I would never have considered discussing with my headmaster. We arrived back at school just in time for lunch, a collation of leftovers from the Christmas dinner supplemented with fresh, hot vegetables. After a stiff walk I was ready for it. After lunch I helped Caroline with the washing up and, again, enjoyed sharing a girly chat with her. She and Amanda have helped me get a lot of things in perspective this holiday. The rest of the day was spent lounging in the common room, reading, playing games on tablets, or watching television. The remainder of the holiday proceeded in similar vein. We had a party on New Year's Eve, but apart from that we pupils were allowed to do pretty much as we wanted. Susie spent a lot of time with me. I think she was so grateful that I had arranged for her to be able to cross-dress well before she had expected to, that I had become her heroine. Actually, it was quite sweet the way she kept asking my advice on how to appear more feminine. As if I, after one term as a girl, was an expert. Although, initially, I had been disappointed not to be able to spend Christmas with my family in Bangkok, I had to admit, in the event, I had had a great time and learned a lot more about being a teenage girl. I was determined to put some of what I had learned into practice during the forthcoming term. Chapter 3 Lower 6th Easter holidays. All too soon the start of term rolled round and pupils reappeared at school. We who had remained over the holidays cleared about things and returned to our own houses. Amanda disappeared and Mr. McPherson reappeared. It was as if his transformation had never happened. It was lovely to see Fiona again, and she quizzed me a lot about how the break had gone. I was great fun. I told her Mr. and Mrs. McPherson could not have done more to ensure we had a proper Christmas. "And how was your holiday?" Fiona told me what she had been up to, and our conversation developed into a real girly chat. Fiona had received some gorgeous new clothes as presents and she could hardly wait to show them to me, so we hurried up to her room where she gave me a mini fashion parade. I was surprised to find I was actually envious that she had pretty new clothes and that I had to make do with my limited wardrobe. Fiona must have seen an expression on my face because she asked me what was wrong. When I told her, she suggested a shopping expedition on our first exit weekend. The following day lessons started and the new term got underway. Time rushed by, and before long it didn't seem that long until we would be breaking up again for Easter. I wasn't surprised to receive a letter from my parents saying that, once again, it wasn't worth my flying out to Thailand for such a short time and that I should remain at school for the Easter holidays. Fiona was incensed when I told her. "Your parents are a bit mean," she said. "Well, you aren't going to have to stay here for another break. I shall write to Mummy and ask if you can come home with me for Easter." That was so sweet of her that tears welled up in my eyes. As a girl, I was learning that it is okay to cry and not to bottle up your emotions. Fiona was as good as her word and immediately wrote to her parents. A few days later, she rushed up to me at breakfast brandishing a letter. "They have said yes," she squealed with delight. We hugged each other. Much as I had enjoyed my Christmas at school, it was nice to know that I would now have a couple of weeks break away from St. Hilda's. When the end of term arrived and it was time to pack our cases, I asked Fiona, should I pack Trisha's things or Patrick's? "Oh, Trisha's, of course," Fiona replied. Last year when I was in lower sixth, I tried reverting back to being a boy for the holidays. It was just too much of a drag, so I agreed with my parents that I would remain in Femi mode for the rest of my time at St. Hilda's. At the end of this year I will have to decide whether I want to go to university as a boy or a girl, but I don't have to worry about that just yet. So I happy packed my case with all my pretty things. Fiona's family owned a small country house/farm in Dorset. As it wasn't an easy place to get to from Derbyshire on public transport, her father, Mr. Symington, drove up to collect us. He greeted me warmly and said how much he and his wife were looking forward to having me stay with them for the holiday. We all chatted happily on the drive south, and although I was a bit nervous to start with, Mr. Symington soon put me at my ease. He treated me as though I was a real girl right from the moment we met, and I started to get excited about the new adventures that awaited me in Dorset. The Symingtons' farm lay in a small valley just inland from the coast. The house must have been there since at least the 16th century, and its grey stones nestled comfortably among the fields and woods of valley. Mrs. Symington had seen us coming, as she was there to greet us at the front door. Fiona was delighted to be home for the holidays and leapt from the car to give her mother big hugs and kisses. I descended more cautiously, but I too was greeted with a warm smile and a hug. "I am so pleased to meet you at last, Trisha," Mrs. Symington said. "Fiona talked so much about what a good friend you have become when she was here at Christmas. It is a shame she didn't think to invite you down then." This was a lovely introduction to the family, and tears prickled in the corners of my eye as I stammered my thanks for them having me to stay now. "You must be tired after that long journey," Mrs. Symington continued. "Tea is laid up in the parlor. Why don't you girls freshen up whilst I pop the kettle on?" I did need to use the loo, so this was a welcome opportunity. After I finished, I splashed my face with water and tidied up my makeup. Mr. and Mrs. Symington were clearly going to treat me as though I was a real girl, and I wanted, therefore, to make sure I behaved appropriately. Over tea, which was delicious and most welcome, I made sure I sat decorously with my knees and ankles pressed firmly together, and that I sipped my tea and ate my sandwiches and cake in a delicate and feminine manner. I was relieved to see that Fiona was so practiced at being a girl that these little mannerisms came naturally to her. I hoped I could be as convincing one day. After tea, Fiona was anxious to show me round the farm. "Change out of your dresses and heels first, dears," Mrs. Symington cautioned. "It is really quite muddy out there at the moment." Fiona took me up to the room I would be using. It was very pretty, with a low sloping ceiling and a window that provided a gorgeous view down the valley. It was furnished in a feminine style but wasn't overly girly, for which I was grateful. I quickly unpacked my case and changed into a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. I wasn't sure about which shoes would be most appropriate, so slipped on a pair of ballet flats. On returning downstairs, Fiona greeted me. "Those shoes won't do, but don't worry, we have loads of Wellington boots and I'm sure we can find a pair in your size." And we did. Now suitably shod, we hurried out. Fiona's first port of call was the stable where she introduced me to her horse, Stardust. "She's a real sweetie," she said. "I miss my riding during term time, so we will take her out tomorrow morning. There are loads of lovely rides around here. You can use Peggy. She's used to be my horse until Daddy bought Starlight last summer. Peggy doesn't go as fast as Starlight, but she is still a good ride." This presented me with a problem. I don't actually know how to ride," I confessed. Fiona was surprised. "Really? I would have thought you did." I explained that traveling about as we had with my parents' diplomatic work, I had never lived anywhere long enough to think about taking up horse riding. Fiona brushed aside my reservations. "Well, not to worry, Peggy is a very gentle horse. You will be fine." I wasn't so sure but decided I would have to give it a try. Leaving the stables, we walked down a track and climbed up to the top of a small hill. From here you could see the sea. "It's a bit early for swimming and the sea will be cold this early in the year," Fiona explained. "However, if you are up for it, we could get some wetsuits out and do a bit of rock scrambling." This sounded fun and I readily agreed. "There is a small cove where we can work on our tan," Fiona giggled. "I do so love getting a tan that shows I have been wearing a bikini top." This aspect of girlhood hadn't occurred to me and I joined Fiona in her giggles. "I don't have a bikini," I confessed. "Not to worry, you can borrow one of mine." Already our holiday was being mapped out and I realized how much I was looking forward to the next couple of weeks. Having explored the farm, which was beautiful, Fiona and I returned to the house. "Mom will have dinner ready shortly," Fiona confided to me. "As it is your first evening with us, we are going posh and eating in the dining room. Normally we just use the kitchen. I suggest you doll up a bit tonight. For the rest of the halls it will just be family style and you can wear what you like." I took her advice to heart and hurried up to my room. During a quick shower I washed my hair. Not having been cut for months, it was now quite long and I no longer needed to wear my wig all the time. However, I decided my hair probably wasn't stylish enough for this evening and so brushed out my wig. "I'll ask Fiona if there is a salon near here where I can get my hair styled," I thought. It would be good not to have to wear a wig with summer coming on when it would inevitably get hot and sweaty. I took extra care over my makeup. Actually, there hadn't been too many opportunities to practice my skills as the wearing of makeup was only permitted on special occasions at St. Hilda's. I had, of course, worn makeup at Christmas and had surreptitiously experimented since whenever I had the opportunity. When I had finished, I was quite pleased with the result. Makeup made me look a few years older than my 18 years and rather more sophisticated. I chose to wear my two-tone blue dress and blue heels with chernoude hose. Greatly daring, I vanished my fingernails a delicate pink. It was only when I came to put my lipstick etc. in a handbag that I realized I didn't own an evening purse. My large handbag was totally unsuitable, so I slipped along to Fiona's room to ask if I could borrow a purse from her. She was just putting the finishing touches to her own outfit and, after mutual congratulations about our choices, she found me a pretty little bag I could use. The dining room looked lovely. The old oak refractory table was set with silver and crystal and gleamed in the firelight and in the glow of candles. Mrs. Symington was looking very smart in a gray sheath dress and Mr. Symington had put on a navy blue suit. "Ah, there you are, girls," he said as Fiona and I entered. "As it is a special evening, would you like a glass of sherry? Drinking was very much controlled and discouraged at school, so I felt quite naughty as I accepted a glass of Amontillado. We had a smoked salmon starter followed by roast beef and all the trimmings. One of our own beasts, Mr. Symington announced proudly. Fiona and I were limited to 1 glass of red wine each, but being a novelty, this was quite sufficient for me. Fiona, being a year older, made a moue of annoyance at her parents' strictness. Her father joked, "When you go up to university you will be beyond my control and what you get up to then will be your responsibility, but for the present you are still my little girl and I won't have you getting drunk." I was a bit surprised and amused that he referred to his genetic son as his little girl, but I guess having established a pattern of behavior for when Fiona was present, it was easier to carry through the transformation all the time. We finished our meal with a lemon tart, cheese and coffee. Everything was delicious and I had to be careful not to overeat. After dinner we retired to the sitting room and Mr. and Mrs. Symington gently quizzed me about how I was getting on with the gender program. My enthusiasm came through as I told them how much I was enjoying giving my female side free rein. I wasn't at all keen at first, I told them, but Fiona was very helpful and patient with me. It is largely thanks to her that I am still on the program and getting so much out of it. Mrs. Symington smiled indulgently at her daughter. "She's a good girl," she said. I slept soundly that night and arose early to the sound of movement downstairs. Quickly dressing in jeans and a t-shirt, I went downstairs. Mrs. Symington was in the kitchen frying bacon. "Life starts early on a farm," she told me with a grin. "My husband has had his breakfast and is already out in the fields." I apologized for being late. "Don't be silly, this is your holiday and, anyway, your internal clock isn't set to farm time," she responded. Fiona came in at that moment and Mrs. Symington placed plates of eggs and bacon in front of us. "It's a gorgeous day," Fiona said excitedly. "Let's go out riding. I can loan you a pair of old jobbers and a hard hat." Well, I wasn't too certain about this, but she clearly wanted me to join her, so naturally I tried to sound enthusiastic. After breakfast the two went up to Fiona's room and, after a bit of rummaging, she triumphantly produced a pair of jobbers. They were pink and overtly girly. Unfortunately, they were also somewhat small and a very tight fit. It took quite a bit of fiddling and adjusting to get my male parts safely tucked away. Although I was used to being tucked, this was something else and I felt somewhat vulnerable. "I hope I will be okay," I said nervously, "only I've never ridden before and these jobbers are incredibly constricting." "You'll be fine," was Fiona's offhand reply. From the depths of her wardrobe, she also found me a pair of rubber riding boots. We went out to the stable yard and Fiona showed me how to saddle a horse. I watched her kit out Starlight and then she made me fit tackle on Peggy, although she took care to check my work and make sure everything was securely in place. I had to be helped into the saddle and Fiona gave me a quick lesson in basic control techniques. "Don't worry, we won't go too fast, nothing above a canter," and with that we set off. At first it wasn't too bad. We set off at a sedate walking pace down the lane and up a track. It was when Fiona opened a gate and took us into a field along the cliffs that things got interesting. "Come on, let's try a trot," she suggested and set off. Being well trained, Peggy followed Starlight. I could see Fiona rising and falling easily with the rhythm of the trot, but, try as I might, I just couldn't emulate her. I didn't want to give in and show myself up, but after a while, the thump of my coming down onto the saddle whilst the horse was coming up, started to cause me real discomfort in a sensitive part of my anatomy. With hindsight I realize I should have said something straight away, but I kept my macho lips tightly gripped and just tried to endure the pain. Eventually Fiona pulled up and turned to me with a happy smile on her face. That was fun, wasn't it? She inquired gleefully. Then she noticed my ashen face and grimace of pain. Are you all right, Trisha? She asked. No, not really, I was forced to confess. My balls are crushed in these joppers anyway, and now with the bouncing up and down I'm in real agony. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry, Fiona gasped. Let's go straight back to the farm. She took hold of Peggy's reins and gently led us home at a very gentle walk. I hung onto Peggy's mane and tried not to faint. When we got back to the yard, Fiona called out to her mother for help, and between them they got me off the horse. Oh, you silly dears, was Mrs. Symington's reaction when she realized what had happened. Here, help me get these joppers off. I was in too much pain to worry about a comparative female stranger peeling off my clothing. Mrs. Symington gently examined my tender and swollen balls. Right, it's a warm bath for you with plenty of Epsom salts and then an ice pack. Before I knew what was happening, I was bundled into the bath, then patted dry, before a nightdress was slid over my shoulders. I don't think pajama bottoms would be a good idea just at present, Mrs. Symington advised gently. When I was lying on the bed, she spread my thighs and carefully wrapped me in a towel a bit like a big nappy and slipped a bag of ice cubes inside. The cold caused me to gasp, but soon the chill made my groin go numb and the pain started to fade. Mrs. Symington gave me a couple of painkillers to swallow and advised me to try and sleep. It didn't take long for me to doze off. At first I slept fitfully but must finally have drifted off into a deep sleep as, when I awoke, the sun was streaming through my bedroom window. I had slept right through the rest of the previous day and the night. I gingerly put my hand down to my crotch. My nightdress and nappy were soaking wet and I was lying in a puddle of water. My immediate concern was that I had ruined Mrs. Symington's bed. Involuntarily I cried out. Mrs. Symington came hurrying up the stairs and into my room. Are you all right, dear? She inquired anxiously. Only I thought I would let you sleep on. There is nothing better for healing than a good rest. Tears welled in my eyes. I'm so sorry, but I think I have wet the bed. It's all right, it is only where the ice pack has melted. And you have done no harm to the bed, as I put a plastic sheet on it whilst you were in the bath yesterday. Well, that was a relief. How do you feel now? Was her next question. Are you still in pain? I was able to reassure her. Actually, whilst I'm a bit sore, it isn't anywhere near as painful as it was yesterday. Good. Let me take a look, Mrs. Symington continued in a matter-of-fact voice. This time I was coherent enough to be embarrassed at the thought of my friend's mother examining my private parts. Spotting my reluctance, she quickly added, I used to be a nurse before I married, so you don't have anything down there that I haven't seen 1,000 times before. With that she whipped off the bedclothes and gently removed my nappy. Oh, that's much better, she announced in a relieved tone of voice. You don't seem to have done any permanent damage, although you are a lovely shade of blue and yellow bruising. If you feel up to it, I would suggest you get up. The sooner you can get your blood circulating properly, the sooner the bruising will go down. Gingerly I swung my legs out of bed and stood up. Instinctively I kept my legs slightly apart to avoid any pressure on the injured area. Well, no tight underwear or skinny jeans today, Trisha, Mrs. Symington advised. I suggest a pair of your soft cotton school knickers and a loose skirt. Whilst I went to the bathroom to clean my teeth, Mrs. Symington went through my clothing selecting a suitable outfit. I have an idea, she said as I picked up my knickers from the bed. Just hang on a minute. She disappeared and soon returned holding a pad of material in her hand. This is a sanitary pad, she explained. I don't suppose you have worn one before, but I have soaked it in an analgesic gel which will help relieve any residual pain. She showed me how to attach the pad to the gusset of my knickers before I carefully pulled them into place. The pad initially felt cold, but soon a gentle warmth spread through my groin and I found I was able to move with less discomfort. "No tights today, you can borrow a pair of Fiona's socks," Mrs. Symington advised. "Now, do you want to wear a bra and your breast forms, or will you be more comfortable keeping things simple?" I had become accustomed to the weight of breasts on my chest and said I would prefer to look as feminine as the circumstances allowed. "Good girl, I can see that, like Fiona, you are a natural at this gender swap business." I felt flattered by her comments, although, as a genetic boy, I should by now have been sensing alarm signals. With my bra and forms in place, Mrs. Symington handed me a simple ream blouse and an above-the-knee A-line skirt. A pair of Fiona's white, frilly ankle socks and my black ballet flats completed my ensemble. I applied a little light, daytime makeup and brushed out my hair. All in all, I felt surprisingly good. The analgesic gel in my knickers was having the desired effect. I walked gently downstairs to the kitchen, where Fiona was finishing her breakfast. She was most contrite about having been so thoughtless about my lack of riding experience. "It's okay," I told her. "It seems there is no real damage done and I was enjoying the first part of our ride until the horses took off." "I can see why you love it so much. It's a shame we won't be able to do again this holiday," Fiona said sadly. "Don't be so sure," Mrs. Symington interjected mysteriously. "I have an idea about how we might be able to get Trisha back in the saddle. Just leave it with me today and I'll see what I can come up with." All very curious. "Now what about today?" Mrs. Symington inquired. "I don't think Trisha should do anything too strenuous, but it is far too nice a day to stay indoors. Why don't I drive the two of you around a few of the villages and towns? Trisha hasn't seen anything much of Dorset yet. We can stop off somewhere for lunch and maybe do a bit of window shopping." This sounded lovely, so we readily agreed. Fiona and her mom were right. Dorset is a beautiful county and I very much enjoyed our brief tour. I sat up front with Mrs. Symington in her Land Rover Discovery whilst Fiona sat in the back, from where she conducted a running commentary on what we were passing. The hills and valleys were very pretty, but I particularly loved the coast. We drove into Swanage and I was blown away by the azure sea and golden sand. Mrs. Symington parked the car and we pottered along the beach and around the town. I had clearly acquired a feminine love for shopping, as I had great fun browsing the windows and enthusing with Fiona over clothes we thought might suit us. Mrs. Symington had a perpetually smile of amusement on her lips at the sight of these two teenage boys getting excited over which dress they might like to buy. Fiona even convinced me to buy a bikini, although when I was going to get a chance to wear it was beyond me. It was still not warm enough for sunbathing this holiday, and I knew Dr. McPherson would never allow any of his pupils to wear such skimpy garments at school. Actually, the bikini I purchased wasn't that immodest. In spite of Fiona trying to get me to buy a really teeny-weeny one, I insisted on something that would conceal my lack of cleavage and provide discreet concealment down there. At any rate, Mrs. Symington approved of my choice. "Don't let Fiona push you into areas you don't want to go," she counseled. "She might talk big, but her bikini is not dissimilar to yours." "Oh, Mom, please don't embarrass me," was Fiona's hurt response. In spite of this potential embarrassment, our little tour of Dorset went extremely well and I seriously enjoyed myself. The next couple of days were spent around the farm. Mrs. Symington drove Fiona and me down to the coast most afternoons and we had fun exploring the rock pools and paddling. As I had surmised, it was too cold for sunbathing or swimming. My bruising rapidly diminished and before too many days had passed, my balls were no longer complaining. Fiona tentatively inquired whether I felt up to trying out riding again. I wasn't at all sure. However, surprisingly, Mrs. Symington was supportive of Fiona's position. I have an idea about how you might be able to ride without risking hurting yourself, Tricia, she said. When I was a girl, my mother insisted I learn to ride side saddle. I still have my riding habit around somewhere. I'll dig it out for you. Riding side saddle doesn't put anything like the same pressure on your groin as sitting astride does. I'm confident you will be able to ride in comfort if you can master the necessary technique. Mrs. Symington was as good as her word and within a short time produced a complete lady's riding habit. It was a complicated outfit. First of all, I had to don a pair of breeches. Fortunately, when she had worn this riding habit, Mrs. Symington must have been a bit larger than I now was, so the breeches fitted without too much constriction of my private parts. Over the breeches, I wore a full-length black dress. My ensemble was completed with black riding boots and a hard cap. I was fortunate as I subsequently discovered that most riding habits came with a hard top hat. Fiona giggled when she saw me so attired, but Mrs. Symington said I looked very nice and reminded her of her childhood. Fiona was dressed, as previously, in joppers, boots, and a hacking jacket. However, I was somewhat surprised to see Mrs. Symington was similarly attired. I thought I would join the two of you today, just to make sure nothing else goes wrong for poor Tricia, she informed us. As we went out to the stable yard, I found that walking in a riding habit is quite difficult. The skirts are full and long and I had to gather them in one hand. Even then I had to take care not to trip, as I couldn't see my feet. Fiona set about saddling first Starlight and then her mother's mare, Swiftsa. Mrs. Symington meanwhile introduced me to the secrets of riding side saddle. I helped her fit Peggy with the saddle and harness and then listened carefully as Mrs. Symington explained the different technique for controlling the horse. She explained how I had to fit my legs around the two horns on the saddle. These give you security for your seat and mean that you can ride almost as fast as you could astride. However, today we are only going to go at a walking pace. She helped me onto a mounting block and hence into the saddle. It felt very precarious at first, but after being led round the yard a couple of times, I started to relax. Mrs. Symington mounted her own horse and we were off. We went at a very steady pace along tracks in the woods. It was very pleasant. I began to understand the attractions of riding. After an hour or so we turned for home. Mrs. Symington suggested Fiona might like to go off on her own for a while. It will take Tricia and I at least 40 minutes to get back to the farm. Why don't you and Swiftsa go off for a good gallop? We will see you back at the farm. As it happened, Mrs. Symington and I got back to the farm quite a bit before Fiona, who eventually pitched up wind-blown and exhilarated from her exertions. I had changed out of my riding habit and was helping prepare lunch. I have had a fabulous ride, Fiona enthused. I'm going to go out every day for the rest of the holiday. What about your friend? Mrs. Symington inquired gently. Tricia can't ride the way you do. Fiona blushed. Sorry, I just got carried away for a moment. Her face fell. Mrs. Symington smiled. Don't worry, you go off for your gallop every morning and I'll take Tricia in hand and teach her the basic skills of riding. This suited all of us as I had really enjoyed my morning ride and hoped I might be able to do more. I was even looking forward to wearing my riding habit again. And that, basically, is how we spent the rest of the Easter holiday. By the end of the 2 weeks I was reasonable confident riding Peggy. I had progressed from a walk to trotting and cantering. I stuck with riding side saddle as I didn't want to risk any more damage to my equipment. On the last night of the holiday, we all dressed up in our best clothes for a final celebratory dinner. Once again, the dining room was laid with silver and crystal, and Mrs. Symington prepared a special meal. Fiona and I helped her in the kitchen, and I discovered I could enjoy another, largely feminine role, namely cooking. As I had only the one smart dress, the blue one I had worn on my first night at the farm, Fiona loaned me one of her dresses. It was gorgeous, and I felt like $1,000,000 wearing it. It was a lovely evening and a delightful end to what had turned out to be a splendid holiday. I thanked Mr. and Mrs. Symington profusely for all their kindness. "Not at all, dear," Mrs. Symington insisted as she kissed and hugged me. "We have loved having you to stay, and you must come again." Then it was time for bed, as Fiona and I had an early start the following morning. Mr. Symington was going to drive us back to Derbyshire and return home in the same day, so he wanted to get on the road as early as possible. As his car pulled out of the gate, I looked back at the farm with moist eyes. I had loved my time there, being part of a real family. I slightly envied Fiona and wished my parents could be more like hers. Fiona could sense I was emotional and gently squeezed my hand. "Don't worry. I will always be your friend," she whispered. The car turned a corner, and that was it. We were en route to St. Hilda's and a new term.